So far in our discussion on the free will topic, we've heard a lot of arguments from the side that says we don't have free will. And we might have started to get this sinking feeling like, well, if we don't have free will, then what should change in our lives? Paraboom, in his article, Why We Have No Free Will and Can Live Without It, he starts off saying, accepting hard incompatibilism demands giving up our ordinary view of ourselves as blameworthy for immoral actions and praiseworthy for actions that are morally exemplary. At this point, one might object that giving up our belief in moral responsibility would have very harmful consequences, perhaps so harmful that thinking and acting as if hard incompatibilism is true is not a feasible option. And there have been some studies that support this worry. So there was a study done at the University of British Columbia and the University of Minnesota where they tested to see if people would cheat more often if they were primed to believe that people didn't have free will. And they found exactly that the more people were primed. So if they read an article that said that scientists and philosophers and theologians have all decided that we don't have free will, that they were more likely to cheat on a test. So we might worry that if people are convinced of this idea that they don't have free will, then it might lead to all sorts of bad consequences. So if there's no free will, should we fool people into thinking that there is free will? Or is it acceptable? Will our lives be as good? Will they be worth living without free will, right? So today we're going to zoom in on free will and why we might not need it. So the problem, again, is if people don't have free will, then they're not morally responsible for their behavior because, as we saw in the arguments about hard determinism, free will seems like a necessary condition for moral responsibility. And that has some, on the face of it, really bad implications for our lives. First of all, and maybe most obviously, if people aren't morally responsible for their behavior, then we might wonder what a society convinced of that belief, what resources they would have for dealing with criminal behavior. So if a criminal isn't morally responsible for what they do because they don't have free will, then what might justify punishing them? Is there anything that do we have to give up punishment? Do we have to give up any adequate way of dealing with criminal behavior? Second, we might wonder if we're not free, if we just have sort of like the illusion of choice, then we might think that our lives have no meaning, that we're just sort of robots going through the motions of being human, but without any real choices and without any meaning in our lives. So that's also a worry. And then third, if we're not free, it seems that in our interpersonal relationships, we treat people and they treat us as if we're all free, morally responsible for what we do. If we're not, then that might be damaging to our interpersonal relationships. Now, Paraboom, in his article, Why We Have No Free Will and Can Live Without It, he's going to try to say that if you're convinced of what he calls hard incompatibilism, which is to say, if you're convinced that we don't have free will and are therefore not morally responsible for our behavior, a society convinced of that would have the resources for dealing with criminal behavior. There still would be reason to feel like your life has meaning, and it wouldn't be too damaging to our relationships. In fact, if we're convinced of this belief, it might even be better. So we're going to focus quite a bit on these justifications of punishment and the meaning of life, and we'll go real quickly through the personal relationship stuff. So justification for punishment. The first thing to note, and maybe the reason we might think that there's a problem, is if there's no moral responsibility, then what's called a retributivist justification of punishment. The idea that criminals deserve punishment, so suffering or deprivation, just because they're morally responsible for the crime that they committed, this justification of punishment is no longer available if everybody's convinced that we don't have free will. So the fact that somebody committed a crime, they wouldn't be morally responsible for that. It would be very unfortunate that crimes were committed, and we could still say they did something morally wrong, but they wouldn't be morally responsible for doing that morally wrong thing. So the retributivist justification that they deserve suffering or deprivation just because they cause some harm, that's not going to work if we're not convinced of free will. So how might we adequately deal with criminal behavior? Well, you might try to justify the current state of affairs, like the fact that we put criminals in prison. You might try to justify it by saying, well, putting them in prison might educate them to do better in the future. Paraboom's going to say, well, that justification for punishment isn't ruled out by thinking that people aren't free and aren't morally responsible. Unfortunately, there just isn't enough support, empirical support, for this idea that that punishment actually educates criminals. In fact, there's quite a bit of empirical evidence to the contrary, that the way we institutionalize people often leads to worse outcomes for those people. So this isn't ruled out by lack of free will, but it's ruled out, it doesn't do enough to justify the current arrangement because of a lack of empirical support. Similar things could be said about a way of trying to justify punishment that says the way we punish criminals deters other would-be criminals. So if we have harsh punishments for people, even if they're not morally responsible for their behavior, that might factor into whether or not somebody else commits a crime. There are many problems with this view. One of the problems is it seems that we should treat people as they deserve. And if you're punishing a person just to prevent somebody else from committing a crime, then it seems like you're using that person in a way that's problematic, right? Also, there isn't very good empirical support for the idea that this way of using punishment actually works to deter other would-be criminals. People often bring this up in discussions about the death penalty. So in places where there's death penalty, there isn't much of a decrease in terms of severe crimes. It doesn't do much or anything to deter other would-be criminals. So again, there's a lack of empirical support here. So what can a society that was convinced of this idea that we don't have free will and moral responsibility, what could they do to justify, to treat criminal behavior? Here's a potential solution. So if somebody gets comes down with a bad communicable disease, something we're all very familiar with now, even if they're not morally responsible for coming down with the disease, and oftentimes they're not, right? Then we still probably think that it's justified to keep that person in to require that that person is in quarantine for a while. So even if they're not morally responsible for coming down with the disease, we think it's morally justified to require that they isolate themselves, or that there's even some sort of forced isolation if the disease were bad enough, right? Now, a similar thing, we could use a similar, if it's okay, if that's justified, then it might be similarly justified that if somebody was a criminal and we had reason to believe that they were going to be a repeat offender and the crimes they were committing were especially brutal, then we might be justified in quarantining that person. Even if there's no free will, they're not morally responsible for the horrible things that they've done. We would just be like, oh, it's really unfortunate, but we have to separate you off from the rest of society so that you don't keep harming it, right? So there is a solution that works. This solution Parabum thinks is both not ruled out by a lack of free will, it's not ruled out by hard incompatibilism, and it's not ruled out by a lack of empirical support. So this is a solution that could work. Now, it might entail ways of dealing with criminals which are radically different than the way we do, especially in this country, right? In this country, the theory that probably underwrites the way we treat criminals is a retributivist justification, so that they deserve suffering or deprivation because they've done something wrong. If we're going to have to walk it back to quarantine, to just separating people from society with the recognition that they're not morally responsible for their behavior, we'd have to take strides to make conditions better in the facilities that we quarantine them in, because now they're not morally responsible, so they don't deserve pain or deprivation. And we'd maybe want to make better efforts to educating them, educating criminals to so that they wouldn't be that in the future. Right. So it should be noted, this will be a sea change in the way we treat criminals, especially in this country. But we still would be justified in separating some people from society, even if they're not morally responsible for the harms that they cause. All right, so moving on to meaning in life. If people are no longer morally responsible for what they do, if I'm not morally responsible for what I do, then a problem would be, well, not only am I not blameworthy for bad things that I do, but I'd no longer be praiseworthy for good things that I do. So my sense of self-worth might take a hit, right? Second, if we come to this view that there's no free will, no moral responsibility, and everything's determined by prior states of affairs, then that might instill an attitude of resignation that what's going to happen will happen. I'm just going to stop trying, right? And third, and related to the first one, no longer being praiseworthy, it might limit my sense of self-worth if I feel like I'm not praiseworthy, if I'm not morally responsible for the good things that I do. So what does Parabum have to say about this? The first thing he says is we can still be happy about our accomplishments. We can feel fortunate, feel sort of blessed that we, if we do something well and we receive praise from other people, we might think, oh, well, we're not praiseworthy. It's not something that we're morally responsible for, but we can still be very happy if we set out to accomplish something and we do accomplish it, right? So there's still a part of this, that remains, even if we strip away the moral responsibility. Second, he says we shouldn't fall into an attitude of resignation to whatever fate will bring, because we lack complete knowledge of causes. And this, I want to emphasize this. We shouldn't fall into resignation because we lack complete knowledge of causes. So we don't know what the future holds. Even if it's causally determined, we don't know what is going to be causally determined to happen. And our attitude and our effort will be part of what brings about whatever is going to come about. So we shouldn't, if we can avoid it, on a proper understanding of hard incompatibilism and this idea that we don't have free will, we shouldn't, that shouldn't lead to us being resigned to what we think is fated. In part because determinism doesn't say things are fated, it says they're causally determined. Causal determinism doesn't say something will happen regardless of what comes before it. It says whatever is going to happen will happen because of what comes before it. And our efforts will play into what comes about. So on a proper understanding of hard incompatibilism, we should not be resigned to whatever we think is fated. Finally, we should note that our sense of self-worth is probably derived quite a bit from things which we already don't take to be features that we have because we willed them into existence. So things like intelligence, empathy, um, and physical attractiveness, etc., etc. Whatever aspects of yourself you take to be fundamental to your self-worth, there are probably a lot of them that you think are due to things like natural factors, like so your genetics, or factors which come to you because of your upbringing or nurture, right? So we wouldn't have to lose that. We might climb down off our high horse a little bit and thinking, well, if determinism is true, it's not like anybody's really pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, right? It's more like they're caused to be the way they are ultimately by factors which are outside of their control. So but I feel like this is probably a good thing to recognize, right? When somebody wins an award, it's kind of off-putting if they go up to accept the award and say, "I'm the greatest thing that ever walked the earth. Uh, Screw all my haters, and I did this all myself." Um, Usually, when people win an award, they start thanking people that contributed to their winning it, right? They'll thank God, they'll thank all the people that contributed to their project. And I feel like that's a good thing, right? So Peerboom thinks there's enough here to still feel like your life has meaning and it's worth living, even if we become convinced of the idea that we're not free and not morally responsible in the way that we thought we were, right? Finally, personal relationships. If we come to view each other as not morally responsible, then we might think that that would undermine what Peerboom calls reactive attitudes, so the way we react to each other, causing us to take cold, objective attitudes, like cold, clinical attitudes towards each other, instead of engaged attitudes with each other. So when we resent somebody or when we're morally indignant about their actions, that seems to rely on this idea that people are morally responsible for their behavior. If we think that person deserves whatever they get, that's like this attitude of moral indignation, moral outrage. And that seems to rely heavily on this idea that people are morally responsible. If we're going to forgive somebody, oftentimes it's because we thought they were morally responsible for their behavior. We come to think that they're not, or we recognize that they're still morally responsible, but they've done enough to show that they're contrite that we aren't going to hold their past actions as a reason to weaken our relationship with them or give up our relationship with them. Similarly, the flip side of that coin of forgiveness is guilt and repentance. So it seems that part of being truly repentant for your action is recognizing that you're morally responsible for it and that you're guilty for it. And that's what sometimes brings about the forgiveness of the person who you wronged. Then there's gratitude. So gratitude, it seems like if somebody does something good for you, then feeling like they're morally responsible for the good thing that they've done for you, and the appropriate reaction is gratitude, that moral responsibility is a key part of it. And finally, there's this idea of love, that we freely choose other people, and that's essential to this idea of love. Now, Peerboom's going to say that most of these reactive attitudes, or at least enough of them to have good interpersonal relationships, should still remain, even if we become convinced of this idea that we are not morally responsible for our behavior. So, first, he wants to say when it comes to resentment and moral outrage, he's going to say, yeah, that does probably depend quite a lot on this idea that we're morally responsible for what we do, but we'd be better off without so much resentment and moral outrage. Along with the, the disease pandemic COVID pandemic that we're facing, there seems to be a growing pandemic of moral outrage at what other people are doing. And maybe we need to rein that in a little bit. So if we became convinced that people are not morally responsible for what they do, maybe that would help. When it comes to forgiveness and the flip side of that, guilt and repentance, he's going to say that key features of those reactive attitudes will remain, even if we become convinced that nobody's morally responsible for what they do. So when you forgive somebody, you're just ceasing to regard past immoral actions as a reason to weaken or end a relationship. And it might be even easier to do that if you feel that somebody's not morally responsible for the harm they've committed, especially if they show that they acknowledge the wrongdoing, if they feel sad and regretful about it happening, and they show that they're taking steps to try to not do it again. So they're truly repentant. Then you might feel more inclined to forgive them, and all that can remain the same, even if somebody's not feeling moral, even if somebody's come to the belief that nobody's morally responsible for any of their behavior. In fact, there's certain kinds of guilt that eat away at a person, and if that might be just like certain kind of guilt that's not healthy, that doesn't lead to improved relationships. And maybe that, just taking the top off that, would be good for people's relationships. Then when it comes to, let's see, gratitude, even if you think somebody's not morally responsible for the good thing they've done for you, you still might feel really happy that they've done something good for you. Like if children don't have free will, right? If a child does something good for you, you still feel really deep sense of joy and harmony and gratitude. Somebody does something nice for you. That's it's still a really good thing, right? Even if they're not morally responsible for what they've done. And finally, when it comes to love, there's this idea that we want people to freely choose us and we want to freely choose them. But note there are many kinds of love that we don't think this about. So parental love, you don't choose to love your kids, you just do love them, right? And many of the reasons we love each other are for things we recognize that the person who we love, they didn't choose. Like, so things like, again, their physical attractiveness to us, their intelligence. Now, we might wonder about their moral character, right? If they're not morally responsible for their behavior, can we still love them for their moral character? And Paraboom thinks, and I tend to agree, that the answer is yes. Even though they didn't freely develop that character, we might think it's a great thing that they have that character and we love them for it, even if they didn't choose to have that character, even if it was determined by factors outside of their control, right? So Paraboom says there's enough here that most of our attitudes, our reactive attitudes towards each other would remain the same, and some of it might be even better, especially when it comes to this moral anger. He thinks the good in hard incompatibilism is that we might get rid of some of this moral anger. Now, moral anger can be good. It can motivate us to resist abuse, discrimination, and oppression. But we have to recognize it also has bad effects and can damage relationships, unsettle societies. It can even motivate people to torture and kill. I mean, think about the current political climate in this country, where each side, thinks the other side is horrible, and they have all the wrong views, and they're morally responsible for having all the wrong views, and they deserve suffering or deprivation, right? That we should probably recognize that that's done harm to our society, right? Paraboom's here to say that if we become convinced that people aren't morally responsible, say, for the views that they hold, then that might temper some of this moral outrage, although we might still have enough of it to resist abuse, discrimination, and oppression, things which are horrible, right? So not only will it maybe not be a bad thing, but it might be a good thing. All right, so that's Paraboom's ideas about why we can still live and function, and how society will still remain very similar, even if we lose this idea that people are free and morally responsible. We covered how punishment might be justified still, although it might have to change. The kinds of punishments we inflict might have to change. In fact, it's not even really punishment anymore, but we still might deal with criminals in the way where we quarantine them, set them off from society if they're likely to cause harm again. We talked about how there could still be a sense of meaning in life and how our personal relationships would survive this change. Although we did note ways that all these ideas would change a little bit, but maybe it's for the best, right? So now we get to quiz questions. Quiz question 1. Which kind of punishment does Pereboom argues is both not undercut by hard incompatibilism, so not undercut by this idea that we no longer have free will, and is not unacceptable for other reasons? So which view of punishment would a hard incompatibilist say, this is the one that's still justified? Is it a retributivist? A retributivist justification? Is it B, for the sake of deterrence? Or C, punishment for the sake of quarantine? Which kind of punishment does Pereboom argue is still legitimate in a hard determinist society, and is not undercut by lack of empirical support, right? Quiz question number 2. Why does Pereboom believe hard incompatibilism should not instill an attitude of resignation in us? A, because we lack complete knowledge of causes. B, because we still have free will. Or C, because resignation is a sin. To answer this question, look back at the section on meaning in life and hard incompatibilism. So back in this video, right? All right, so that's all for today. Thanks for sticking with us. Next time we'll get to some arguments that we do have free will because our actions are not completely causally determined. So we'll look at libertarian views of free will in the next video. Thanks.